The subject of the Tower of Babel is fascinating, and I've loved this subject, actually going back probably at least 10 years, maybe a little bit more than that. And what it was, if I look back in my past, I was raised up by the world. I grew up in a moderately Christian home. It wasn't perfect. I go to Sunday school, but, we didn't get into anything really in depth. I heard gospel sermons over and over again. You hear a little bit about Paul's missionary journeys and so forth. But then I went to state schools. And when I went to the schools, I was taught an entirely different history from what the Bible taught. I was taught that man had evolved from lower creatures. We evolved out of Africa from some ape-like creature. And then you got a little bit smarter. We went from hunters and gatherers. And then we got smart enough to actually start planting our own food, and we started to cultivate things. And then you start to build some civilizations, some little minor cities. Finally, you get to some major civilizations: Mesopotamia, Egypt, Samaria, some of these different places. Indus Valley, I know, is one of the early ones. But then all of a sudden, I realized, hold it, how does this fit with the Bible? Well, come find out it doesn't fit with the Bible. It's totally different from what the Bible says. So as a kid who went to church and a kid who went to state schools, I was struggling with these issues. So for a long time, I just kept the two in two different places. I give some church answers. Yeah, we go back to Adam and Eve. Then you have Noah. Well, somehow you get down to Abraham, and you don't even, I was lost a lot of times. Then with the world, hey, what answers do they want? And I would give that. So I really struggled with that. And it finally kind of came together when I was like, well, is there any history from the flood going all the way forward to reach up to someone like Abraham, which we follow Abraham's lineage, or for that matter, history that leads all the way up to me? And I was surprised to find that cultures all over the world actually kept track of their history. Now, what I had been taught in state schools was not recorded by ancient historians. You don't see that at all. That is an entirely different history, a new history that has been applied to the past by modern people. If you want to find out what happened in ancient history, really what you need to do is go find out from historians who recorded it and who were there and were involved. And come to find out, I was blown away at how much research there really is from the flood going all the way up to Abraham and beyond. Now, the Bible records an event called the Tower of Babel. It's only 9 verses. It's not that much. It's right there at the beginning of Genesis chapter 11. It says originally everybody had one language, essentially one speech. And they tried to defy God because they didn't want to scatter. They didn't want to go out and fill the earth like Genesis 9:1 commanded. When Noah and his family came off the ark, the Lord said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. In fact, as he repeats that in Genesis 9:7. But these guys, they came together. The descendants of Noah said, let's build a city and a tower and let's not be scattered. They tried to defy God's command. Now, what happens when you try to defy God's command? Well, God steps in. He came down. He saw the city and the tower that they had built. If he would let them get away with it, then, well, essentially they'd be able to get away with anything. So the Lord confused their languages and scattered them to different parts of the world by their family groups. So husbands and wives and their immediate children would go to different places. Now, that actually explains a lot in the modern world. It explains, A, why we have different languages, why languages change and flux in the first place, why there are different people groups in various parts of the world. Now, that fascinated me. There's 9 verses that explain so much about the world. Well, if you follow in the Bible, it continues with a lineage that goes down through, from Noah all the way down to Peleg. You follow from Peleg all the way down to Abraham. And of course, we follow the lineage of Abraham all the way up to Christ. And that's a lot of times what we focus on when we are talking about different things at church. But I thought, well, what about all these other people? You know those genealogies in the Bible that no one likes to read because you get to it and you just hope in Bible study that you're not the one called on to read them because you're like, how do I pronounce these things? And, people really struggle with some of those names, but I found those names to become fascinating. Genesis 11, 1-9 gives you the chronological account of what happened at the Tower of Babel. The chapter before it, Genesis chapter 10, gives you a breakdown of Noah's 3 sons, their grandsons, great-grandsons, great-great-grandsons in some instances. And if you tally that up, there's at least 78 families that came out with a new language. I say at least 78 because there are some places there are other sons and daughters. And, so it's kind of a minimum number there, at least 78. So there were that many people at the events that occurred at Babel that kind of give a foundation. And believe it or not, a lot of those names we can find going back, with ancient royal genealogies, with ancient historians. Names of places often reflect some of these names. We see this all the time. Over here in America, where we're at, in northern Kentucky, where the Creation Museum is and the Ark Encounter, America. Where does the name America come from? It actually comes from Amerigo Vespucci. Goes back to the name of a person who decided to put his name on a map, and it's kind of fascinating. You see that with Scotland. Where does the name Scotland come from? It goes back to the name Scots. So we see these types of things, this reflection, and believe it or not, we find a lot of these names in various parts of the world. Particularly, the closer to Babel you are, the more you see these names. We do see them extending into Europe, into Africa, into Asia. By the time you get to the Americas, by the time you get to Australia, sometimes it's sons, grandsons, great-grandsons. People have picked up and kept moving. So places like Kentucky. Kentucky is named for the land of the Kentucks. That's over here in America. And Kentucks was one of the Native American tribes. It's named for someone in their past. However, that's not somebody going all the way back to the Tower of Babel. There are generations missing in some of that. But, the Bible explains a lot of that. And I get fascinated by looking at some of these genealogies and some of these people. Let me just do a handful of examples. I'm a mutt, if I can say that. A mutt over here is like a dog that's got all sorts of different genes from all sorts of different things. It's not a pure breed necessarily. I like to call myself a mutt in fun because I've actually got some German, English, Irish, Scottish. I've got some French blood. I've got some Swedish blood, some Norwegian blood. I've got some Portuguese blood. I've got some Native American blood. I've got all sorts of stuff. And I love to trace some of these different peoples because I used to look at that and I said, well, where did they come from? I mean, I see the lineage of Abraham, but where did I come from? Where did, say, the Germans come from? Well, believe it or not, a lot of the ancient Germans actually kept track of their history. There was a historian back in the early 1700s by order of a prince of Great Britain, Dr. James Anderson, and he actually went to a number of places and said, okay, let's trace these ancient royal genealogies. And the Germanic people actually have a continuous lineage from Noah down through Gomer, down through his son Ashkenaz, and that's actually their lineage going there. They actually had a continuous link of kings from King Ashkenaz all the way down to about the same time as King Saul, just to give you an idea where that's at on a biblical time frame. But Ashkenaz is actually a reflection of certain names that you find in Germanic areas. Scandinavia, Ascandinavia, is actually a variation of Ashkenaz. That's where that name comes from. Saxons. The Angles and Saxons migrated over to the British Isles. And when they came over there, you see the reflection of that name. A lot of people don't realize where these names come from. They're just variations of Ashkenaz. So, anyone with some Germanic ancestry actually would go back one way or another and have some blood from Ashkenaz. It's fascinating. The Irish actually have three ancient lineages that all go back to Magog, that's just fascinating. Now, a lot of Magog's descendants actually moved north of the Black Sea. A lot of the Scythian peoples came out of there. Think of the South Russians. In fact, Magog actually conquered big portions of Russia. I know Russia's a big country, so you got a lot of different people groups in there. So I get fascinated by some of this. Now, I'm talking, to some people who came over from Europe, from Scotland. Well, what about Scotland? Well, actually, a lot of the Scottish groups are actually part of the Caledonia groups. That's actually one of the ancient names for Scotland. The G's and the C's were kind of interchanged in a lot of ancient languages. You might think Caledonia or Galatonia, the G's and C's. Celt, these are all part of some of the Celtic groups that had actually come out of Gomer. And there was a number of different groups right up in these different areas, and they were there well before, a lot of the Angles and Saxons moved over, which wasn't until after the Romans essentially had moved out, just to give you that on that time frame. But I'm fascinated by some of these groups, and you see some of these and you can trace them, and I love it. The Greeks, the Hebrews, when it comes to the Egyptians, these are the easy ones because, believe it or not, they're actually mentioned in the Bible. They're right there in some of the Holy Lands. The Egyptians and a lot of the sons of Egypt and some of these different places, they were actually descendants of Mitzrayim. That's one of Noah's grandsons. It looks like Mizraim, but it's actually Mitzrayim, I think, is more the Hebrew pronunciation of that. But anytime you see Egypt in the Old Testament, what's behind that is the Hebrew name Mitzrayim. So it's just named for their ancestor. If you look at the Hebrews, obviously they go back to Abraham, go back through Peleg. If you look at Canaan, that's an easy one. Canaan is one of Noah's grandsons, and Canaan, the land of Canaan, we know right where that area was. Now, there were different Canaanite descendants that went to different parts of the world. The Sinai Peninsula were named for the Sinites, wilderness of sin. We see that in the Bible. Mount Sinai specifically. We see that reflection. They go back to the Sinites. That's one of the groups of Canaan. Well, a lot of those Sinites actually migrated out and moved over and founded China. They're actually mentioned a little bit later on in the Bible. Sin-Nim, I think, is one of the names given to them. We still see that reflection in more modern times. When China and Japan went to war against each other, it was the Sino-Japanese War. You still see some of those names reflected. Some of the other names, the Greeks. The Greeks were descendants of Javan. That's the Hebrew name there. Now, we also saw Tarshish and Kittim, Septimus, some of those places there in the Mediterranean. So you still see some of those names. Sometimes these names are mythized, or they're developed in myth because they've lost who the true person is, or they've been embellished, or they've been made to a godlike status. A great example of that is one set of descendants there listed in Genesis chapter 10 is the Naphtalites. Well, who were the Naphtalites? Their ancestor was a man named Neptune. And we see Neptune in Greek mythology, where he has been elevated to a god of the sea. But he actually did have some islands out in the Mediterranean, and the people have since moved off to a lot of different places in the world. So, some of the things that we see from the Tower of Babel help explain what's going on in the world today. Let me just move over now and talk just a little bit about languages. The Tower of Babel is obviously associated with languages. Now, I know the word Babel. I assume there's going to be a lot of people around the world that hear me say that, and I keep saying Tower of Babel. That's how a lot of Americans say it. I just want you to know, I understand in different places in the world they say Babel, and believe it or not, a lot of people ask me, where in the world is this name? Is it Babel or is it Babel? Well, in the United States, we're allowed to say it either way. I think if you go over to places like England, Oxford, it says Babel. That's what you're supposed to use there. In Australia, they say Babel. So, I've had to deal with those kind of things here in the United States. But forgive me if you're used to hearing Babel and I say Babel. But, when it comes to languages, the Tower of Babel explains a lot about languages. Now, today we have just under 7,000 languages in the world, about 6,900. I think that includes spoken as well as some extinct languages that we're fairly familiar with. We still try to decipher certain things as well. Now, there are also new languages that are out there. Constructed languages are what these are called. Esperanto is one of those. Klingon, believe it or not, is a language. For those of you who know a little bit about Star Trek, people have actually developed that into a language. So there are constructed languages. Sometimes people try to lump into languages some of the computer languages, BASIC or C or Fortran, things like that. But I'm trying to look at strictly the human languages, the ones that may go back to Tower Babel. Well, like I said, that's about 6,900 languages. Was there that many people that came out of the Tower of Babel? Not at all. Like I said earlier, there was about a minimum of 78 language or families that came out with a new language. Like I said, minimum, so it could be a little bit more than that. But how do we arrive at, say, 6,900 languages? About 7,000 languages. Well, languages tend to change. Now, I married a lady who was from Australia. Now, she doesn't sound like she's from Australia, but now once in a while she'll throw a word in, or, I've had to learn certain Australian phrases. But, I've been to Australia, and that's a different language from American English. I've been over to England. They have a totally different language there as well. In fact, in different places in England, you see different accents there as well. You go to Canada, they have a slightly different accent. You go to different parts of the United States, you get different English accents. You go to Tennessee, it's a very sweet Southern drawl. So we see variations even within English in our modern culture. The way the Scots or the Irish speak English, it's totally different. And sometimes, people struggle to communicate. I had my wife's uncle from Australia came up here, and we were in the hills of Kentucky. And there's an accent in the hills of Kentucky. Like I said, there's an accent in Australia. Well, these two people were trying to talk back and forth to each other, and they were struggling. They kept saying, what? I don't understand you. And so I jumped in, I started translating, and I realized I'm translating English to English. And it just goes to show how the languages can change. But a lot of people don't realize that English is actually classed as a Germanic language. English, German, Norwegian, Austrian. These are variations within the Germanic language family. We see the same sort of thing with Romance languages, languages of Rome. You might think of Latin, the old root to a lot of this, but then you have French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, or modern day Italian. These are variations within the Romance language family. Now, a lot of researchers have studied some of these language families, and typically they say there's somewhere anywhere from about, I've seen numbers from 94 to 100. They kind of change their numbers just a little bit depending on what they lump and if they use constructed languages or things like that. But, I think a minimum of 78 language families come out of Babel, and we have a maximum of, say, 94 to 100. We're right in the ballpark. This is what we expect to find from a biblical perspective. So, when I read the Bible and then I go out and I look at the world, I say, wow, this is fascinating when I start to see it.